This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library, number VL-017. Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. We have been studying the book of Job. We saw that Job was a righteous, a just and fair and good and upright man who feared God and shunned all forms of evil. And yet Satan claimed before God's court that Job only serves you because you bought and paid for him. You've blessed everything he has. You've protected him from any calamity. Well, if you were to put forth your hand and touch what he has and harm what he has, he would curse you to your face. Well, God gave Satan permission, and Satan destroyed everything Job had. And yet Job worshiped God and said, well, I came into this world with nothing. If God takes me out of it with nothing, so be it. So again, Satan came before God's court, and God pointed out to Satan, hey, look, Job maintained his integrity in spite of you inciting me against him to destroy him, swallow him up with no cause. Satan said, he was not big enough man to admit he was wrong. He says, it's just because you didn't let me touch him. Skin for skin, everything a man has he'll give for his own soul. If you'll just put forth your hand now and touch his body, his person, why then he'll curse you to your face. And again, Jehovah, to this challenge to him and his ways before his court, he gives Satan the permission he asked for, but he says, spare his soul, spare himself. And so we're on Job 2 and verse 7. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. So we've returned. We've been going back and forth from seeing the scene with Job and his family on earth to the scene with the Lord and Satan in heaven. And we did this back and forth. Now we return from the scene in heaven in God's court to the scene on earth with Job. And Satan leaves the presence of the Lord with the permission he asked for, the permission to harm Job personally in his body. And then we read that he smote Job, he struck Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot onto his crown. So this was his choice of a way to attack Job with this permission he'd gotten from Jehovah, is to strike these terrible boils from the very sole of his foot onto the crown, the top of his head. He receives boils on every inch of his body. Verse 8, and he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. So apparently these boils itched and bothered him. So he takes a potsherd, a broken piece of pottery, to scrape himself with as his itching tool. And he sat down among the ashes. Now this was another sign of grief. To sit among ashes was a sign of grief, although I also wonder if he's using these ashes to put on the boils and try to treat them too. But what a sad, pathetic figure Job, this mighty man of wealth, must have made at this point. Verse 9, then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. So even his wife urges him to give up his integrity before God. Now I think, judging from what she did here, that Satan left her alive very purposefully. Notice he didn't have Job's wife die. But he left her alive for this very thing that she just did. To use her as the one to try to instigate Job to just give up. To give up on God, to curse him and just be satisfied to die cursing God. Now, this is actually changed in the Hebrew manuscripts. And the Sopharim, the Sophers, that means wise, and the Sopharim are the self-styled wise or knowing ones. And they were a band of ancient Israelites who took it upon themselves to edit the Bible. And they thought, I guess, that they respected God more than God did. And then, like that Job's wife said, curse God and die, so they changed, through a little editing of the text, they changed the word curse here to bless. Bless God and die. Well, fortunately, our translators didn't buy the change. They left it cursed, as they should have done. Usually, in fact, they follow what the sophers said and follow their unfortunate edits. But in this case, it was just so ridiculous and so grievous that they didn't follow it. And they put it as it should be, curse God and die. Verse 10, but he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? So he says to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. And foolish here is Nabal. Remember, in David's day, the woman Abigail had a husband named Nabal, which he said means fool. Now understand, though, that in the Bible we think of the fool as being the mentally deficient person. But the fool in the Bible is not so much mentally deficient as the fool is morally deficient. The fool is the morally deficient one. And so he says, you speak as one of the morally deficient women would. And he says, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil, meaning calamity? Should we be willing to accept it when God brings good into our lives, but not accept it when he brings calamity? What kind of a thing to do is that? Once again, notice that Job proves Satan wrong. He refuses to curse God. In light of all that's happened to him, he will not do it. Yet notice once again what Job is assuming here, that it is God who is doing all this to him. He never once considers Satan, or that it's Satan's cruel hand that is bringing all this horrible calamity on him. He never seems to consider that Satan might have anything to do with it at all. He thinks it's all God, and the cruel hands of Satan that are harming him, he imagines are God's hands. So in all this, Job did not sin with his lips, and yet he made a very important wrong assumption. Well, now we come to Job's three friends, verse 11. Now when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Sophar the Naamathite. For they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. So Job has three important friends who hear of all this evil. Notice their evil means calamity, like it often means in the scriptures. They heard of all this evil that was come upon him, all this calamity. And they came everyone from his own place. They came from their own lands. These are not friends who lived next door to Job. These were friends who were kind of the same station as he was, high and mighty type people, but from other lands. And they came from those lands to see him from their own place. Now the first is Eliphaz. And Eliphaz means either my God is gold or my God is strength. Now there was a son of Jacob, Israel's brother Esau, with the name Eliphaz. And we read about this Eliphaz in Genesis 36. Genesis 36 and verse 4. And Adah bare to Esau Eliphaz, and Bashemath bare Reuel. So Esau married a woman named Adah, and she bare her firstborn son was Eliphaz. So he was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. And so this might help us locate about when this Job might have lived. Now, this Eliphaz is said to be a Temanite. And Teman means southward. And there was a grandson of Esau with this name, Genesis 36 and verse 11. And the sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, and Gatam, and Kenaz. So, this Eliphaz is said to be a Temanite. So maybe he's not actually Esau's son, but maybe his great-grandson, a son of Teman, who takes his grandfather's name. Now, Bildad means confusing love. It could mean confused by mingling. Mixed up love through mingling. Well, Unfortunately, love can be confusing when people mingle with a lot more than one sexual partner. That makes love kind of confusing, doesn't it? Bildad could also mean son of contention, of arguments. He's called a Shuhite, and that means wealth. And Shua was the youngest son of Keturah by Abraham. Genesis 25 and verse 2. Do you remember that? A lot of people don't remember that after Sarah died, Abraham took a second wife named Keturah. And in Genesis 25:2, she bare him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. So, the youngest son of Abraham through Keturah was Shua. So, this might be a descendant of this Shua, a descendant of Abraham through his second wife Keturah. Now, Shua was probably also east of Israel, like Esau's territory was. And then we read about Zophar. And though that's spelled with a Z in our Bibles, it's kind of a TS in Hebrew, Zophar. So if you imagine a TS together, Zophar. And it seems to mean a sparrow. Now, Namah means pleasantness. And the land of the Namathites, don't know for sure where that was. Some people think it was in southern Judah. Before, of course, Judah dwelt there. So these were leading, basically, important men, like Job was. And they might have been leaders, perhaps even kings in their own countries. Now, as such, it's very doubtful that they came by themselves. It wasn't just three men coming up to Job. No, they probably brought large entourages, retinues of servants with them as they came. Now we read that they came to mourn with him and to comfort him. And at first, of course, that's what they did. Comfort there means encourage. Yet later on, I can't help but notice that they became somewhat less than encouraging. Verse 12, and when they lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, they lifted up their voice and wept. And they rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. So as they're looking far off, as they're coming up to Job, he's so changed they can't recognize him. Well, imagine this powerful, rich man. Now he's lost everything, probably dressed in rags, maybe in sackcloth, the traditional sign of mourning, all covered with boils from head to foot. You probably can barely recognize him, scraping himself with a broken piece of pottery. And it's just such a horrible sight, they just can't help but they start to cry. And they do the traditional signs of mourning. They tear their clothes. They threw dust over their heads toward heaven, just showing through these traditional signs of grief what a heart-rending sight Job was at this time, and no doubt he was. Verse 13, so they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. So they wept with him, and they sat down with him, and yet it seems they sat in silence. Now, I don't know that they literally didn't say anything. Maybe they said, I'm going to the bathroom or something. But it could be they didn't say anything. I mean, it seems like an odd thing to really come to comfort Job, and yet for 7 days not to say a thing. But maybe in light of his great grief and the horror they all felt at seeing him reduced to this horrible condition and what Satan had done to him, maybe they just couldn't find anything to say. Yet during this time, from what they did after this, apparently they were going through this whole thing in their minds and forming arguments in their heads as to why this must have happened to Job, what the cause must be, what the purpose for it is. Because, of course, the human mind hates purposelessness, and they wanted to say what the reason was. And we'll learn that after 7 days, when they did open their mouths, what they said was not so comforting to Job. Well, this brings us up to chapter 3 and Job's first statement. He kicks off this argument, which is going to take up the majority of the rest of the book, between Job and his friends. So chapter 3 and verse 1, after this opened Job his mouth and cursed his day. So Job is finally the one to break the silence, and he was probably the proper one to do so, after all that had happened to him. They didn't feel they had a right to speak up first, but he does finally speak up. He opened his mouth and cursed his day. What's his day? Well, I believe this means his birthday, and not just meaning the yearly one, but the actual day of his birth, the day on which he was born. He curses that day, basically because he wishes he never had been born. Verse 2, and Job spake and said, so emphasizing that this is what Job said. So opened his mouth, cursed his day, spoke, said. I mean, these are all emphasizing the fact that this is his statement. And a very emphatic one, and one that he has thought out. It comes bursting out of him after 7 days of fomenting, we might say. Verse 3, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. So Job wishes he had never been born, and we can't really blame him for it. I mean, after all that had happened to him, after he lost everything, all his children, all his wealth, his health, he's just lost everything. He says, I wish I'd never been born. Well, how can we blame him? Now this begins the poetic portion of Job. And a lot of people, when they think of the Bible and poetry, I think they only think of the Psalms. That's the only poetic book they know. But really, there are other books that are in poetry for a greater part of them. And certainly this is true of Job. The majority of Job is poetry. It's true of some other books as well, like Isaiah. And everything that Job and his friends says is given to us in verse. And this makes me wonder, did Job and his friends actually argue in verse? Were they able to speak and argue in verse on the fly? Or is this just the author of the scriptures later kind of modifying and adapting what they said into verse? Well, it seems that these were intelligent men, and it seems to me that perhaps, indeed, they did speak their arguments in verse. And that could be a thing they did when they wanted to make official proclamations, is that they give them in verse, so they were practiced at it. Now, I doubt they talked in verse when they said, pass the salt, but when they were making official proclamations, they do it in verse, perhaps, and that's what they do here. Now, E.W. Bullinger, in his companion Bible and in his writings, offers a translation of the poetic portions of the book of Job. He doesn't translate the prose portions like what we just read up till now, but he translates the poetic portions. And he tries to put it in meter in English. Not in rhyme, but in meter. Of course, it's almost impossible to translate rhyme. And Hebrews didn't really use rhyme much anyway. But I'm going to be reading from this. I think it's a good translation, for the most part, of the book of Job. So Job 3 and verse 3, starting from Bullinger's metrical version. Perish the day when born I was to be, or night which said, a man-child is brought forth. So he says, perish the day. The Hebrew word is abad. It comes from Abaddon, which means destruction. But perish that day in which I was born. Why? Because Job wishes he never had been born. Again, how can we blame him considering what's happened to him? Or the night. Job, apparently, his mother never told him whether he was born at day or night. He says, whichever it was, if it was night, cursed be that too, the night in which said, a man-child is brought forth. In other words, to his mother. Someone said, a man-child is brought forth. Now, the Hebrew is geber, meaning a strong man. A strong man-child is brought forth. Verse 4. That day, may it be darkness evermore. Let not Eloah care for it above, and let not light shed on it one clear ray. So he says, that day may it be darkness evermore. So again, he's cursing his day of birth and says, let that day always be considered a dark day from now on. Oh, that terrible day when Job was born. Let not Eloah care for it above. Now, Eloah is a name for God. Understand, the typical name for God in Scripture is Elohim, which is God, plural, gods. And yet it always comes with singular verbs. God's is instead of God's are. Very interesting. But Elohim is used for the creator and judge. But Eloah, the singular, and El is the simple singular. Eloah is kind of an extended singular. like my name is Nathan, but Nate is the shortened version of it. Well, Eloah emphasizes God who is to be worshipped. The venerable God, the God who ought to be worshipped. Eloah is connected with God's will rather than El is connected with his power. Eloah is connected with his will. And Eloah is also the living God, in contrast with inanimate idols. If you're talking about, there's the idols on the one hand, and there is the living God on the other. That's often Eloah that's used that way. So he says, let not Eloah care for that day on which I was born above, and let not light shed on it one clear ray. Let not there be any light on that cursed day when I was born. Verse 5, let darkness stain it, and the shade of death. Let densest clouds upon it settle down. Let gathering darkness fill it with alarm. So again, he's going on pouring curses on the day of his birth. Let darkness stain it in the shade of death. Let death's darkness be on that awful day when I was born, he says. Let densest clouds upon it settle down. Make it a cloudy, miserable day. Let gathering darkness fill it with alarm. Let it be like, a horrible storm is coming. No. Let that be the kind of day on which I was born. I don't know. I don't remember. But that's the kind of day it should have been, considering the kind of life that's come upon me. Verse 6, that night, let darkness take it for its own. Be it not joyous mid the other days, nor come into the number of the months. So he says that night. Again, he doesn't know if he was born in the day, in the light, or in the night, in the dark. He says, if it was night, let darkness take it for its own. Let darkness just lay claim on that night. Be it not joyous. The King James says, let it not be joined unto the days of the year. But that word really means joyous or rejoicing. Let it not be rejoicing among the days of the year. You know, there are days that are rejoicing days among the days of the year. Some there are holidays you're supposed to rejoice on, like Christmas or Thanksgiving. And other days maybe a personal rejoicing, like birthdays. Or just good days. You just pick out a day and make it a good day. Go on some kind of outing or something and celebrate a party. He says, let not that day I was born be like that. Nor let it come into the number of the months. Kick this day out of the months. Let it be a day that no longer exists. Verse 7, lo, let that night be solitary. Let no joyful voice come therein. That's the King James, or I'll read Bullinger's version. Lo, let that night be cheerless evermore, and let no joyful sound be heard therein. And solitary, as it has in the King James Version, means cheerless. Now, there are nights that are cheerful. I mean, if you have a dark night, but you have some cheerful burning campfire that you're warming yourself at, or maybe you're getting together and drinking a warm glass of something and talking with friends. I mean, that can be a cheerful night. He says, let that night be cheerless evermore. Let there be no cheer in that night. Let no joyful sound be heard therein. No happy sounds. No celebration. No happiness going on that night. Because that cursed night brought about my birth. Verse 8, let those engaged in banning days curse this. Those ready even to rouse Leviathan. So those engaged in banning days, those who curse days. Well, what would be a cursed or a banned day? Well, there are days that can be pronounced bad days. For example, days when the president might announce today, flags need to be flown at half-staff in the nation, or maybe a governor, flags flown at half-staff in this state. Well, that's basically making that a sad day, proclaiming that to be a day of sorrow. He says, let those who do such things curse that day of my birth. Let them peg that day above all other days to be a day of mourning. Then he says, well, the King James says, who are ready to raise up their mourning. But as Bullinger translated, those ready even to rouse Leviathan. The word there is Leviathan, not mourning. Now, what is Leviathan? Well, we'll find out more about Leviathan later in Job, but it seems to be a kind of monstrous dragon. Now, people tend to scoff and mock when you talk about dragons, because you think, oh, that's just a mythological creature. Well, of course, in some fantasy stories, there are mythological creatures. They do things like fly and talk and things that no creature could do. But the fact is that really dragons in the past were what we call today dinosaurs. Dinosaurs. What's the difference between a dinosaur and a dragon? A dinosaur is a terrible lizard that breathes fire, and it's fantastic, never existed. Well, what's a dinosaur then? Well, a dinosaur is a terrible lizard that doesn't breathe fire and did exist. Well, really? I mean, how do you know this? You look at their bones. How can you tell from a dinosaur's bones whether it breathed fire or not? I mean, do bones come with a little label, this creature did not breathe fire? I mean, how do you tell from bones whether it breathed fire or not? And besides, who says all dragons breathe fire? I mean, if bats went extinct, which one do you think everybody would remember? The vampire bat, of course. But that's only one kind of bat. I mean, the fruit bat doesn't drink blood. The majority of bats don't drink blood, just one kind. And I think the majority of dragons didn't breathe fire, just one kind, probably. But Leviathan was a dragon, was a dinosaur. Now, they're extinct as far as we can tell, although I wouldn't. Some of them, if they're very shy creatures, might exist in some out-of-the-way places and hide themselves, and we don't know about them. But there was a time when Darwin had put out his theory, and yet he admitted the weakness of his theory was the fossil record didn't show all these transitional forms there must be. So he thought evolution can be proven by archaeology. So a bunch of enthusiastic Darwinists went into archaeology in order to find proof for evolution. Well, they went out to find proof for evolution, and they didn't find the missing links they sought. But what they did find is a bunch of old dragon bones. So what they should have said is, oh, guess what? We proved, dragons, the things that people were starting to think were probably a myth because they never saw one. Anytime a creature goes extinct and then you never see one, you think it's a myth. That's just kind of human nature. I never saw it, so it never existed. Well, these archaeologists weren't interested in proving whether dragons were a myth or not. They wanted to prove evolution. So they, having gathered in lemons, they made lemonade. They said, oh, we found bones of terrible lizards. We'll call them dinosaurs. Gave them a new name like they were a new thing, but they weren't a new thing. They were dragons. There was already a name for them. Stupid to give them a new name. Then, of course, they denied the most significant thing everybody remembers about dragons. They breathe fire. And then they come up with a fantasy story. Well, maybe they lived millions of years ago. Maybe these lived in this period, and these in this period, and these in this period, ignoring the fact that all through history we have record of people fighting these giant lizards and these terrible lizards, and all cultures on Earth have legends of these things and stories of people fighting them. Then we ignore all that and come up with this fairy tale about millions of years ago to prove evolution, because that's why we went into archaeology, and we just don't care about whether there are dragons or not. But the fact is there were dragons. They are the same thing as dinosaurs, and they existed with humanity. They didn't go extinct millions of years ago. That's just a fairy tale. And it's dragons that are the true story. And it's amazing how evolution can make you credulous to fantastic stories and doubt reality. Now, basically what Job means here is that anyone who roused Leviathan, who roused this monstrous dragon, that would be a bad day. That would be one bad day that you roused Leviathan. So he says, let my birthday be like that day. Verse 9. Let all the twilight stars thereof be dark. Let it look forth for light, but look in vain, nor ever see the eyelids of the dawn. So he says, let all the twilight stars of it be dark. No stars on that day. No beautiful lights in the sky on my birthday. Let it look forth for light, but look in vain. When's the light going to come? No light. Nor let it see the eyelids of the dawn. Let not the sun rise on that day, that cursed day I was born. Verse 10, now he says why he hates that day so much. Because it shut not up my mother's womb, and from mine eyes hid all this misery. He says, I curse that day because I wasn't still born. Because I was brought forth successfully. Because I had a successful birth. My mother successfully gave birth to me. That's why I curse that day. If only that had never happened and I had died. He says, because then my eyes would have been hidden from all this misery. I never would have seen all this miserable condition I'm in now. Verse 11, Why should I not have died within the womb? Or when brought forth, why not have then expired? Yes, why not? Why couldn't I have died in the womb? Plenty of children do. Why couldn't that have been me? Or when brought forth, why not then have expired? King James has give up the ghost, but there's no word for ghost or spirit there. The Hebrew word is gavah, and it means to expire. Why couldn't I have expired right after I was born? Barely lived and died right after birth. That happens to plenty of babies. Why couldn't it happen to me? Verse 12, wherefore were nursing knees prepared for me? Or why were breasts prepared that I should suck? So he said, why did knees meet me? Why did nursing knees meet me? King James had prevent, but prevent in Old English meant to go before to meet someone at a place. And it didn't mean to hinder like it does today. Pre-vent. Vent means to go. To pre-go. To go somewhere before someone else. That's all it meant. Didn't mean to hinder. But, like Bullinger makes it, wherefore were nursing knees prepared for me? Why were breasts prepared that I should suck? Why wasn't I just abandoned and allowed to die right then? Verse 13, for then in silence had I been laid down, I should have sunk to sleep and been at rest. He says, if only I had died then. Death would be so peaceful and restful compared to what actually has happened to me. Now notice here Job's view of what death is like. Job views death as being like sleeping, like rest. I wonder how many people view death that way today. They don't know as much as Job did. Verse 14, with monarchs and with counselors of earth, the men who build their moldering monuments. He says, I would have been dead as a stillbirth, yes, but I would have been dead with monarchs, with kings. The Hebrew is melech. With kings and with rulers of the earth. The Hebrew there is eretz. It can mean rulers of the land. He says, what difference? Once a king and a ruler of the land is dead, they're no different from a stillbirth. These men build moldering monuments, yet what good does it do them? They would have been with me, and I would have been with them if I would have died a stillbirth. Verse 15, with princes who in life possessed much gold, and who with silver had their houses filled. So again, he says, I might have been a stillbirth, but I would have been just as dead as the princes who, when they were alive, possessed gold and filled their houses with silver. I mean, what's the difference once you're dead? You're dead. Verse 16, would I had been but an untimely birth, like stillborn babes which never see the light. He says, if only I had been a miscarriage. If only I had been stillborn. Never saw the light, so that the light would fool me to think there's good in the world, and then it's all going to end like this. Verse 17, for there the wicked cause no more annoy, and there the wearied ones at last find rest. He says in death, the wicked, the Hebrew is rasha, the criminals, of course like those who stole half his flocks, or three of his 4 flocks. His largest one was burned up by fire from Satan. But he says, no wicked person, no criminal can annoy you when you're dead. And there are those who are wearied, those who are worn out with life. They at last find rest. He says, that's me. I'm worn out with life. I would at last find rest if I was dead. Verse 18, together with them captives find repose, and hear no more the harsh taskmaster's voice. And certainly back in those days, those taken captive in war were made slaves, given taskmasters, and had hard life from then on. But he says those who live life in captivity as slaves, they at last find rest. They at last find relief from the taskmaster's voice and death. At last, they're at peace. Verse 19, the small and great alike are gathered there. The servant from his masters is set free. So he says, whether they're small and lowly or whether they're great and high, they both end up in that same place, death. And the slave from his masters is at last set free in death. What a desirable thing it is, he says. Verse 20, wherefore unto the toil-worn gives he light, where life prolongs to the embittered soul. He says, why does God keep people alive who are just worn out by hard work? Why does he prolong life to the embittered soul, the embittered person? Like me, Job means. My life has become so bitter. Why does God keep me alive? Why doesn't he just let me die? Verse 21, to those who look for death that cometh not, and seek for it as those who treasure seek. Job says, man, death for me would be like a treasure. So valuable to be dead. He says, when I fall asleep, I'd like to not wake up, but alas, I wake up to more suffering. Verse 22, who would rejoice with exultation, yea, be glad indeed if they could find the grave. He says, why doesn't God give death to those who would rejoice to find it? Now, grave here is keber, meaning a sepulcher or tomb. He says, I'd just be so glad if I could find a tomb and rest there. Verse 23, the grave, 'tis for the man whose way is hid, for him whom God hath hedged round about. He says, the grave is for the man whose way is hid. No one can find him to cause him trouble anymore there. And God hedges him about. Eloah, again, the venerable God to be worshipped. He protects them in the grave from all misery. He says, like my children, they're dead. They don't know the misery I'm experiencing right now. They're at peace. I'm the one who's miserable. Verse 24, for sighing cometh in place of food. My groanings are like water poured forth. So he says, sighing and groaning are now like my food and water. I'm getting sighing instead of food and groaning instead of water. Verse 25, for that which I so feared hath come on me, and what I dreaded, that hath come to me. You say, what did Job fear and dread? Well, what could he have feared and dreaded that hadn't happened to him? I mean, if he'd feared losing his riches, he lost them. If he'd feared losing his children, he lost them. If he feared losing his wife, well, she told him to curse God and die. If he feared losing his health, he lost that. I mean, what hadn't he lost? What could he possibly have been afraid of that hasn't come on him? Except death, and he sure isn't afraid of that anymore. He wishes he had it. So everything he dreaded came on him. Verse 26, I was not careless, nor did feel secure, nor rested without thought, yet trouble came. So he says it wasn't from lack of concern, it wasn't from carelessness. It wasn't because I said, anytime this good I had could be taken from me, so I better appreciate it and I better care for it. No, he said I always did. I was always careful. And yet my care meant nothing. This calamity came on me. So in this portion, Satan struck Job with a terrible illness that left him suffering and in misery. His 3 friends came to comfort him, but when they saw his horrifying condition, they were too overwhelmed by his troubles to speak for 7 days. Job at last speaks first and curses his birth. Death and stillbirth seem like a great boon to him now compared to a life with such trouble. He wishes for death, yet he complains he can't find it. Well, we'll see how these friends who came to comfort him offer him comfort. And we'll look at that in our next study. Until we meet again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.